Which countries will run the world in the 2040s? It's not the ones you think. I'm going to be projecting all the top geopolitical powers, demographics, military, economics, and geography to determine who can make other geopolitical entities do what they want. Some of the rankings are going to be super predictable. Some of them are going to shock you. Like, why would Turkey be ahead of multiple countries with nuclear weapons? I'm not going to go through all the countries, but I am going to list the top 31 geopolitical powers in the year 2040. And we're going to start off with the United States. I do think the United States is waning in power. They're no longer a hegemon. It is a multipolar world, or at least a bipolar world. However, the country still has some of the best imbued natural advantages of any geopolitical player. 2 huge ocean barriers make their defense extremely manageable, and an abundance of natural resources. Pairing that with relatively favorable demographics compared to most of the other countries out there, put the United States in a position to retain its top spot in the geopolitical power rankings. And I expect China to still be number 2 in 2040. While they will have major economic issues that they will have to navigate, I do not expect the world's manufacturing superpower to be unseated in the next 10 years. All those skilled workers, all those factories, all that infrastructure built up will still be of tremendous value. And already having a population less than India, China has accrued way more wealth. Their GDP per capita is far higher than their southern neighbor. And if they were able to do some development with the interior of their country, you got to keep in mind, while a lot of Chinese people have been lifted out of extreme poverty, many of them are still living at near subsistence levels. And if you were able to just provide a little bit of development, a little bit of uplift to that population, China would remain an incredibly formidable adversary for anyone looking to get them to do their bidding. Number 3 is going to be the first curveball of this video, and I'm going to call it the Western European Confederation. What I'm suggesting here is that Germany, France, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands will bind themselves even more closely together than they already are into a confederation. I'm not talking the United States of Europe with a central federal government. But much like Canada is a confederacy, and you wouldn't find many similarities between Quebec and Alberta, imagine a Western European Union of those wealthiest, highest GDP per capita entities binding together even further to exert more geopolitical power on the region around it. Leaders of these countries are looking at the United States stepping back from the North Atlantic Treaty at the same time as Russia is ramping up its aggression. The leadership, the military unity, the collective potential of greater state capacity between these substantial economies will create a really powerful geopolitical entity, and is required, because if the EU just stays in this mediocre, highly bureaucratic, low growth arrangement, that's basically a death sentence to everyone involved. They need to stimulate more growth. They need to have more negotiating leverage. And I'm expecting multiple trading blocks, multiple confederations to really come together over the next 2 decades out of Europe. But we won't get to the next one for a little while. Up next is India. They already have the world's largest population. They are experiencing enormous growth and are one of the world's largest economies. Their biggest issue is that they have even worse development problems than China. The GDP per capita is still far below any of the other countries that we're going to reference here in the top 10. And there's 2 things holding them back from external influence. One of the reasons is that most of their leaders are elected to solve internal problems, build infrastructure, get people access to clean drinking water and toilet facilities and other basic things that are taken for granted in many of the other top powers of the world. And then simultaneously, their geography prohibits them from really doing a lot of power projection. The Himalayas give them this huge boundary that both protects them and restrains them from going northward. They have a nuclear power Pakistan immediately on their western border. And while they do have some growing naval assets, they're nowhere close to being able to project power into the Middle East. And if they go the other direction, that's where China's rapidly growing navy is exerting more and more power in the South China Sea. So India is going to have its region of influence. It is going to be a regional leader. That region just isn't going to be the most desirable one to be able to exert influence into. Number 5 is Turkey, and they have the exact opposite situation. They do have the largest standing army in all of Europe or the Middle East, and they sit at a really interesting geography. They have land-based routes of the old Silk Road, the current Belt and Road Initiative, and they can project power into Europe as a member of NATO, as an immediate neighbor that holds a ton of migrants that are displaced through conflict in the Middle East. They also have deep ties to Qatar and other Middle Eastern countries, and they have no immediate competitor besides Russia. And if Russia were to drive all of their attention and all of their power directly at Turkey, that'd be a huge problem for Turkey. But Russia's not really in a position to be capable of doing that. They have issues all the way to the north, borders with Finland, borders with the Baltic states. They have the ongoing issues in Ukraine. They have a subservient position to China across Siberia. They have some insecurity in Central Asia. And they don't really have the resources, the demographics, the assets to project major power into Turkey and really have to find a way to be an ally more so than an adversary. And while I think Turkey's economy has been pretty woefully mismanaged for the last half decade, that simply cannot continue. That is a basic constraint. You already see policy changes occurring in the Erdogan regime. And regardless of whether it's Erdogan or some other leader in the future, I would expect more prudent, better growth policies to be initiated, which could make them an economic force in addition to a military one. I'm putting Russia at number 6 right after Turkey. And the idea here is that while they do have nuclear weapons and an enormous landmass, they have much greater internal issues to deal with. They have a really large defense budget, but a lot of that needs to go towards internal security issues with things like the Chechens and other groups that would break away from Russia if they saw the opportunity and saw weakness from the center. So they have to spend a ton on internal security, similar to China, much more than some of the other players on this list. And while much has been made about their economic partnership with China, they are in the position of being a price taker as opposed to a price maker. Examples of a price maker is, say, NVIDIA or Taiwan Semiconductor. Everyone wants their AI chips. They can name their price. They can allocate it to whatever client they want to. That is being a price maker when you have the high in-demand good and control the supply. Russia doesn't have the ability to sell their stuff everywhere they want to, which means they kind of end up being price takers for what China is willing to purchase a lot of their natural resources for. I don't expect that to change anytime soon, which is a boon for China and negative mark on Russia. Number 7 is Japan, and we're starting to get into the area of high variance picks. I think those top 6 are pretty solid, barring something really unforeseen black swan event. Here's where, a couple dice starting to get rolled different ways could drastically change the board. Japan's really old, but really technologically advanced. They've been dealing with an aging society for a long time, managing that decline. They have strategies in place. It's not some new problem that is just going to explode on them. They've been managing this issue for a while. They do have strong navy, and they do have the ability to project a lot of influence around Asia. Now, they have to manage the relationship with China, but if there is anyone that can actually go to the negotiating table and not just get bowled over, Japan is probably at the top of the list. We've got 2 other Asian countries that also have some capacity there. But the biggest variable here is going to be, can Japan continue to be a technological leader as their workforce declines? Can they implement robotics? Can they implement AI? Can they have defense technology that continues to garner a real seat at the table? Or will they kind of fade into a weaker position like some of the people later on in this list? Brazil is number 8, and this is really more predicated on their ability to continue to be an agricultural and natural resource powerhouse, to prop up their economy. Will there continue to be demand from China, potentially from the United States, potentially from Europe for the goods that they're selling? And coming back to the central premise of this video, can you project power on other entities? Brazil's going to have a hard time projecting power onto any of the countries that I've listed so far. But all of those countries are not really paying super close attention to South America. Yes, they have embassies and they have objectives, but in terms of the priorities, Europe, Asia, the Middle East are all much higher priorities on the list, potentially even Africa, than South America. Brazil, meanwhile, looks at all its neighbors and says, we are the more powerful one in all of these relationships. And so therefore, they can make a lot of stuff happen in the southern part of the Western Hemisphere. And for that reason, we're keeping Brazil at number 8. Number 9 is South Korea. Similar story to Japan. They are aging rapidly. They are having huge issues with fertility rate. They are in a very potentially dangerous neighborhood with North Korea as an ally and China right across the North China Sea. However, there are two crazy interesting upside stories. Number 1, North Korea isn't exactly doing well. And if that state were to collapse, China would probably take some of the land, some of that territory, but I think a lot of it would reunify with South Korea. That gives them way more people, that gives them way more of a population to deploy into factories, into manufacturing, into their other economic potentials. And those people are coming from a pretty low level, so lifting them up is a huge
People had to spend the money only in their neighborhood.
Simultaneously, Samsung and the other technology coming out of Korea right now is on par with just about anyone on the planet. Korea is one of the largest defense exporters, punch way above their weight in that realm, and we've seen that in the war in Ukraine. And wouldn't expect that to end anytime soon. So another player that can go to the negotiating table with both the United States and with China and actually hold their own to some degree. At some point on this list, we're going to stop being able to say that about folks on the list, and they're going to kind of just be the price takers for those two major powers. But South Korea absolutely can and will be heard from. Iran is a similar story at number 10 as a kind of swing geopolitical power. The idea here would be you have a very large population, they're not that old, they're well educated, and while Iran is under an enormous sanctions regime currently, I'm not expecting that to continue in perpetuity. As the old guard leadership starts to age out of running Iran, you could see modernization, you could see changes occurring with the relationships. They've been punched in the mouth over the last few years, and that could cause a real strategic pivot that would change some of the objectives. I look at a country like Saudi Arabia and the way that they've modernized. They've kind of moved away from Wahhabism being the central organizing tenet of their society. You could see a similar moderation coming out of Iran. And if that were the case, there's going to be a lot of people that want to do business with them. They have huge oil reserves. They do have a ton of human capital that could be deployed towards much more positive sum aims than they're currently being used on. And if all that stuff doesn't come to bear, they still control the Strait of Hormuz. They still have a very close relationship with Qatar. They do have the ability to project power into Pakistan, into other parts of the Middle East, and are worth keeping your eye on. Now, number 11 is going to be Indonesia, and this is one that could be climbing significantly if some of the other players ahead of them on the list fall off. Indonesia has a huge population. That population is very young, and we talked before about your ability to go to the negotiating table with the big powers and actually get what you want. Indonesia's done this. They've gone to China and said, we're not just going to be miners of nickel. They have the biggest nickel reserves on the world so that you can process it and turn it into batteries. We want to do the processing here. We're going to put tariffs on you, China, in order to build up our processing facilities. And they've done that. They've done it successfully, and they want to continue to do that with other parts of their economy. So they are rapidly growing from a GDP and GDP per capita perspective. They have the demographics, and they're far enough away that they're not imminently going to be invaded by some other regional power. So they have real security despite their military not being that advanced yet. And I would expect them to continue to be powerful negotiators as long as there are these two major poles. Some folks are going to be forced to pick sides. Indonesia is one of the few that can really kind of play both sides to their benefit. Saudi Arabia is number 12, and this one is really just kind of a wealth play. They have so many oil reserves. They have huge sovereign wealth funds. They are growing from a debt perspective, but there is no doubt that the ability to leverage that wealth into power is something that Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudis understand deeply. They are making huge connections. They're making investments into AI. And while they're not necessarily going to get the best of every negotiation with the powers higher on this list, they're at least going to be able to hold their own. And I do give them a ton of credit for the modernizing and moderation of their politics over the last 2 decades. I'm putting Singapore at 13. It's a huge financial hub. It has a really important strategic location in the Strait of Malacca. And kind of like Indonesia can play both sides, maybe not the same amount of power projection, but they are just this high center of gravity point for capital, for trade, for deal making to be done in the region in a way that no other power is really set to occupy. Most other characters are set to take a side, and simply being able to be independent as a city-state, which it looks like Singapore is going to be able to continue to do, puts them in a very influential position. So number 14 is going to be Ukraine. Now, you're going to hear that, you're going to think, they are really reliant upon money from other countries in order to be able to defend themselves. And point taken. But the argument that I would make here is that they are basically turning into a garrison state, meaning a country that is specifically propped up, given military equipment, empowered in order to hold back a geopolitical power that other entities want to counter. So we're going to talk about Taiwan in a couple of picks here, but that's essentially what happens when military technology is sent, sold to Taiwan. You could argue the same thing has happened historically with Israel, where it's got military technology to counter Iran on behalf of the United States. So Ukraine is now getting that from currently the United States and Europe. And even if the United States steps out of that role, they have developed a ton of military capacity out of necessity with their backs against the wall. They will continue to receive a ton of military equipment as long as they exist, because as long as they exist, Russia isn't knocking on the door of a NATO country. And so I would expect them to be extremely militarily capable for the next 2 decades. And that puts them in a position of major leverage, major negotiating leverage, both with Russia and with the other powers of Europe. Now, I'm going to batch the next 2 together, 15 and 16, Canada and Mexico. Canada and Mexico have a very specific problem, which is they are neighbors with the United States. And the US is so powerful, they kind of suck all the oxygen out of the room. It's very hard for Canada to project power into the United States. In most, not all situations, they are the price takers, not the price makers, as evidenced by the USMCA, which Trump negotiated in his first presidency, is being renegotiated during Trump 2. And that's all instigated from the seat of power of the President of the United States. Mexico and Canada just have to be like, okay, you know, they're trying to negotiate, but they're price takers in the fact that that deal is getting retraded. And I wouldn't expect that to change anytime soon. But if you buy the narrative of climate change, Canada has all the room to continue growing population. They have enormous natural resources and could easily grow their population and could turn into a major net energy exporter to places besides the United States. And that in of itself gives it negotiating leverage with perhaps some Asian countries like Japan, who would need its natural gas, potentially some European powers. And then simultaneously, Mexico has the ability to project power into Central America, potentially the top of the northern parts of South America, as it becomes a increasingly important manufacturing partner for the United States. All the friend-shoring, all the near-shoring is really beneficial to Mexico's economy, gives them a ton of upside, and they're going to leverage that wealth to be able to influence the other parties around them, as long as it doesn't come into direct conflict with the United States. After that, South Africa, they're going to have a ton of influence in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a ton of natural resources coming out of there. There isn't really another power locally that's going to make waves. The biggest issue is that's just not the highest value corner of the world to be influencing. So a lot of influence there, but similarly, they kind of need to stay in the good graces of China, of the United States, and don't have a ton of negotiating leverage in the biggest relationships of power. We're getting towards the end of the folks that can actually kind of hold their own with the US and China. I would say Qatar is one of those last ones. Huge natural gas supplies, really important for both Europe and Asia in that regard. A ton of wealth to go do soft power influence, both regionally and globally. And really, I think the biggest risk factor, the variable downwards for them, is a bunch of parties kind of coordinating to kind of wake up to Qatari influence in so many domains and kind of getting kicked out or just getting a really bad, I guess, brand reputation would give them a huge downside and throw them lower on this list. But the baseline execution here keeps them in the top 20 most influential countries. United Kingdom, they've got nuclear power, they've got navy, they've got a ton of soft power in their former colonies through language. The biggest issue is that it's kind of a historical outlier that such a small country with such a small population was as wealthy as it became. And so it is something of a managed decline more so than a growth story. I would argue that the same thing is kind of true of our next two, Australia and Israel. Australia, just because I think the commodity boom has peaked, and that's going to see a kind of continuing decline. And Australia is really one of the first ones where we're looking at them and saying they're price takers between the US-China thing. Like, no one else on this list I really think has a ton of ability to extract a lot in negotiations with those two parties. They kind of have to be price takers. And Australia's situation is they're completely dependent on the US for defense and security, and completely dependent upon China for their economy. So while they can kind of play the other off the other, it's more likely that China's going to say, hey, don't have so many US military bases. And they say, well, we can't. It's like, okay, well, we're going to be buying a whole lot less from you, or stopping our foreign students from going to Australia for university. And meanwhile, if, they start really deepening economic ties with China, then the US is going to be like, yeah, maybe we don't build that second military base in Northern Australia, and you're going to have to fend for yourselves a little bit more. So it's a tough kind of straitjacket to be in, and yet they still have a lot going for them relative to some of the other powers we're about to say. Israel, similarly, you're seeing them lose influence in the United States to a major, major degree. Hard to even identify, is the left or the right in the United States a better ally to Israel at this point in time? And yet they have nuclear weapons. And so they are going to be heard from. They are going to continue to have regional power projection, but they are, I think, losing influence globally in a way that we haven't seen in recent memory. Putting Argentina at 22, and this is one of the toughest ones because I do think I am very bullish. I made a whole video about it on Argentina generally, in the sense that it has a ton of natural resources, agricultural capacity, very few security concerns. The biggest kind of constraint here is where are they projecting power into Chile, into Uruguay. These are not consequential entities, kind of similar to the South Africa story, and they will have to contend with Brazilian power on the South American continent, but really almost from a standpoint of being insulated from influence is really why I ended up with Argentina at 22. Pakistan, really this high 23 simply off of a huge population and nuclear arsenal. But besides that, they are smushed between Iranian and Indian influence and Chinese influence. They have a little bit of lean on China simply from the fact that they're so indebted. It's like the parable of like, if you owe the bank $1 million, you're in trouble. But if you owe the bank $100 million, the bank is in trouble. There's a little bit of that going on with like Belt and Road Initiative stuff in Pakistan, but they're seeing huge immigration flows out of the country. That's brain drain, that's lost resources. And so outside of that, there's not a lot going for Pakistan. Taiwan, I kind of feel similarly. They are a bit of a garrison state in that particularly the United States is arming them so that they could be that porcupine that China can't invade or really wound itself if it did invade. However, in China, we see Huawei and other huge developments on the semiconductor front, which reduces Taiwan's influence as the source of high-end semiconductor chips. At the same time, we have fabs being built in the United States. We have fabs being built elsewhere. So it seems like we are kind of near or at the peak of their influence in that regard. And the concern is that by 2040, if the world has diversified its sourcing of semiconductor chips to some degree, then its support both diplomatically and militarily will be waning, which could put their strength into jeopardy. So I still kept Taiwan on the list here, but I think there's kind of a tail risk or a downside version of this that has them completely off the list, unfortunately. United Arab Emirates, this is kind of similar to the Saudi story, similar to the Singapore story. Huge ability to implement technologies like AI, to have really high-level state capacity in that regard. They do have huge sovereign wealth from all their energy resources, just not quite the same scale scale or relative geographic significance that some of the other entities do, but still going to be hugely influential. Number 26, kind of similar to that European Union that we talked about, a Nordic Union, Sweden, Finland, Norway. Sweden punches well above its weight from a technology perspective. Norway sitting on huge oil reserves and potassium discovered mines. If you buy the story that like the Arctic is the future of international trade, really relevant there. And so similarly, some sort of union there, perhaps with Iceland as well, would give them far greater negotiating leverage than they would have separately. They've kind of grown closer and closer together. Could see something similar, maybe not quite a confederacy, but some other form of union between those entities that would give them negotiating leverage against those European powers, against Russia, and in conversation with the United States. Poland at 27 is one of those entities that really, I don't think, can fall further than this unless they were to just absolutely have to deal with some sort of tail risk invasion of Russia that they unsuccessfully defend. That's hard for me to wrap my mind around, considering the defense spending, considering the population, considering the NATO integration. But with that said, they are increasingly becoming one of the powers of Central Europe and have a really compelling economic growth story that I don't see slowing down anytime soon. Nigeria at 28, large African economy. I'm not super bullish on Africa generally, but huge population, influence across West Africa. Not really sure what that gets you at the high end. It seems like a little bit more managing chaos than one would want, but they are able to exert influence in that region. Kazakhstan, similar story for Central Asia. If, maritime trade were to collapse and there were to be just a horrible challenge with piracy and interstate contests over shipping routes and land-based trade became more important, Kazakhstan has a really big role to play because of their location on historical Silk Road, Belt and Road travel pathways. And simultaneously, they are an energy exporter between oil and gas and uranium for nuclear. They do have points of influence there. So potential a little bit of upside from the 29th spot, definitely relevant. And then finally, we have Vietnam. Vietnam is becoming one of the points for folks that are looking to get out of China. They're making huge investments there. I think the West, and particularly the US, thinks about them as Vietnam as being a place that was a really scarring war for the US military. Similar stories for the Chinese military. Vietnam has been a huge problem. That huge land border that they have is kind of something of a soft underbelly that could cause fractures with China. So they do have a little bit of negotiating leverage and just geopolitical pressure points to push. Maybe that would make the argument that they should be higher on the list than some of these entities because of their ability to influence the big poles of power in the world, but they don't have a huge amount of differentiation between their immediate neighbors. Vietnam isn't imposing itself on Thailand, on Myanmar, on Indonesia, on the Philippines. And so while they do have that negotiating leverage with China, a major power, they're kind of at even strength, more or less, with some of the other powers of their immediate region. But want to include them at number 30 and finally put Ethiopia at 31. Ethiopia controls the genesis point of the Nile River, which means that they have influence on Egypt, which has influence on the Suez Canal. Unfortunately, Ethiopia has been dealing with civil wars on and off for decades. And if you were to sell me on the idea that they could clean up that internal instability, they would be able to exert some power at the Horn of Africa, where I would say there isn't a huge single entity exerting influence or power. So that is 31st country on the list. Here's the list of all those countries again in order on the screen. Roast me in the comments. I'm sure you have disagreements about placements or countries that we left out. And thank you for watching to the end.